I've been playing Endfield since launch, and the discourse over the game has genuinely started to bother me. And I believe that these so-called criticisms that people put forward hurt the game when it's aimed at the wrong aspects. So through this video, I aim to provide a clear outlook on the most discussed issues so far in the game's lifespan, being the content drought. Let's start off by defining what content in Enfield can be classified into. When you look at what Enfield offers, you can primarily split the content into four categories: story, combat, exploration, and factory. Any and all elements in the game related to these core ideas can be definitively called real content for the purpose of this discussion. Now that we've defined what can be considered content, let's go over them one by one. Looking at story content alone, Enfield provides around 30 to 40 hours of main story gameplay, which can extend to roughly 75 to 85 hours when side quests are included. Whether that story is good or not is a separate discussion entirely. For now, I'm only concerned with measuring the amount of content available. Taking the exploration and the factory systems, it would be hard to get an exact estimate on how long it would take to complete, as it completely depends on the person's playstyle and understanding of the mechanics. Specifically for the factory, as it poses a pretty steep learning curve for inexperienced players. Through a few online websites, the rough completion time sits around 300 to 350 hours for all modes. We can also see Hypergriff is experimenting with factory-related events, as seen with the Palm Top Savior quest, which works on pre-existing production lines and adds value to constantly being up to date with new factory systems. Combat-based content is much easier to judge, as most of the current game modes heavily lean towards the combat route. Currently, the main modes related to combat are Umbral Monument, Trial of Sorbency, Re-Crisis, and Contingency Contract. We can categorize Delver of the Cryptic as a test to core gameplay mechanics, and Edge-based Salvage as an exploration plus combat game mode with some extraction and roguelike elements added to it. From this, we can see that the existing content is substantial, and depending on how you play, you can stretch that existing content indefinitely. Then why do people still feel that there's a content drought? And more importantly, is it Hypergriff's fault? One of the major arguments against Enfield has always been, why can't a company with 7 years of gacha experience deliver an all-round experience for players to enjoy? They argue Arknights has top-tier game modes like Integrated Strategies, Stronghold Protocol, and Reclamation Algorithm, which are all widely considered as some of the best game modes in all of gacha. Yet, they could not implement the same level of content in their new title. What people making these arguments fundamentally get wrong is, though Hypergriff is the developer behind both Arknights and Enfield, both are worked on by two different in-house studios, namely Montagna for Arknights and Mountain Contour for Enfield. Furthermore, Arknights is a 2D tower defense game, while Enfield is a 3D open-world action combat RPG, both massively varying in genre, requiring completely different expertise and direction. We're effectively comparing a new game studio to a studio that has had 7 years to develop its game, define core gameplay loops, and understand its player base, and expect the former to deliver the same level of content in a mere 6 months of release. Being precise about it, we can clearly understand that a majority of the experience Hypergriff has in making games is almost irrelevant to Enfield. Mountain Contour is in Montagna, and Arknights is not Enfield. Comparing one to the other is unfair. But if you're still not convinced, let me show you what other gacha giants were at release, and if they felt fuller. For this point, I'll be using Arknights, Wuthering Waves, and Genshin as the main three games for comparison. Starting with Arknights. The global release for Arknights was in January of 2020. Following the release, we get a variety of side stories, and finally, a true game mode in Contingency Contract 5 months later, in June. And only in 2021 do we get the first integrated strategies. Following with Genshin, we get Fire Abyss being the sole game mode, and Genshin's over-reliance on disconnected minigames make it very weak in the replayable content category. In addition, depending on these DPS check timer slot game modes goes to show that Genshin is below what modern gacha game standards should be. Where things get interesting is when we get to Wuthering Waves. Wuthering Waves came out with both Tower of Adversity and Depth of Elusive Realms, both of which can be considered replayable game modes, with the latter getting consistent updates and is a roguelike game mode. Tower of Adversity provides buffs to certain units, and these buffs tend to benefit the newest banner character. Granted, you need not use these characters specifically, it still runs as a gacha shield game mode. From what's shown, we can get a clear idea of the content structure during the first 6 months of launch these gacha games had. And more importantly, we get to define the fundamental design philosophy of Hyperglyph. Slowly and steadily, each successive update of Enfield has brought more and more content to the game. And as proven through Arknights, we see that Hyperglyph tend to deliver specific game modes that fit the overall theme of the game by first fundamentally understanding the audience and innovate the gacha landscape as a whole. Even games like Wuthering Waves have been using timer slot game modes and a variety of mini games that don't relate to the core idea of the game itself. And even though these games on paper have had more replayable content than Enfield at release, the quality of these game modes become less desirable and aren't unique or engage the player beyond standard attention. The point I'm trying to make here is that Hyperglyph focuses on innovation rather than playing the safe hand. They redefine the very concept of game modes in gacha games. And innovation takes time, effort, and most importantly, an understanding of the consumer. This innovation is already seen within the game, with modes that fundamentally serve Enfield, like the Palm Top Saber event, the various unique mechanics of Umbra Monument stages, and even X Space Salvage has its own unique outlook. Each of these game modes prove that Hyperglyph is still experimenting with what players like and what players want. Modern 3D gacha games have conditioned players into a mindset that if there's not enough content to play every day, the game is facing a content drought. The constant feeding of these DPS check timer slot game modes, which players have been openly against for many years, has become a standard that is expected to be followed. When that standard is broken by a slower paced game, the experience fundamentally feels lacking. The question Enfield proposes really becomes, would you want more content or good content? Would you rather let devs take time to find enjoyable replacements to these unfriendly game modes, or have them stoop down and implement the same slop other gacha games receive? The problem Enfield is facing is not a content issue, rather an identity issue. And if Enfield wants to define its own identity, it cannot do that by stooping down and using the same game modes gacha games heavily rely on. We've already gotten no RNG gear farming in events that solely rely on pre-existing mechanics of the game, and as Hyperglyph have clearly shown, they know what players don't like, and are constantly working on more and more content for the game that fits Enfield and define what long-term content would look like for the game. I think the strongest criticism of Enfield today is not that it lacks content, but that players want more reasons to repeatedly engage with the content that already exists. Whether that simply is a flaw or a consequence of hypergrowth's slow development philosophy is ultimately the real debate.